Hello, and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with free and inclusive resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2024 conference brings you this session, making each word count, a short story masterclass. Today we have C.H. Hung. C.H. Hung, she, her, grew up among the musty book stacks of public libraries where she found a lifelong love for good stories and lost 20/20 vision for good. Her stubbornly rational soul intersects with an irrational belief in magic, which means her stories are often as mixed up as she is. She writes science fiction, fantasy, and mystery, and dabbles occasionally in nonfiction, poetry, and drabbles. Her stories have appeared in Analog, SF&F, Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, Dreamforge, and Choreo magazines, as well as anthologies edited by Kevin J. Anderson and Christine Catherine Rush, among others. Read more at chhung.com. Dawn Vogel has written for children, teens, and adults, spanning genres, places, and time periods. More than 100 of her stories and poems have been published by small and large presses. Her specialties include young protagonists, siblings who bicker but love each other in the end, and things in the water that want you dead. She is a member of SFWA and Codex Writers. She lives in Seattle with her awesome husband and fellow author, Jeremy Zimmerman, and their cats. Visit her at historythatneverwas.com or on Blue Sky at historyneverwas. Hien Nguyen is a speculative fiction writer who hails from the Midwest, but has lived on both coasts. By day, she is a social science researcher, and by night, she writes about Vietnamese ghosts, monsters, and mythology. She is interested in the uplifting and haunting forms of human connection and how SFF writing can lay those bare. Hien's work has been published by Invisible City, All Worlds Wayfarer, and others. She is a mentor for Write Girl and Round Table Mentor, a member of the Codex Writers Group, and an alumna of the Juniper Summer Writing Institute. An indoor cat disguised as a human, Hien enjoys going bird watching with her significant other, binging K-pop variety shows, and absorbing hot pot broth like a sponge. Hien is represented by Caitlin Detweiler at Jill Greenberg Literary Management. L. Marie Wood creates immersive worlds that defy genre as they intersect horror, romance, mystery, thriller, sci-fi, and fantasy elements to weave harrowing tapestries of speculative fiction. She is the recipient of the Golden Stake Award, a Myco Award-winning screenwriter, a two-time Bram Stoker Award finalist, a Riesling-nominated poet, and an accomplished essayist. Wood has won over 50 national and international screenplay and film awards. She has penned short fiction that has been published in groundbreaking work, including the anthologies Sycorax's Daughters and Slay, Stories of the Vampire Noir. She is also part of the 2022 BookFest Book Award-winning poetry anthology Under Her Skin. Her nonfiction has been published in Nightmare Magazine and academic textbooks such as the Cross-Curricular Conjuring Worlds, an Afrofuturist textbook. Her papers are archived as part of University of Pittsburgh's Horror Studies collection. Wood is the vice president of the Horror Writers Association, the founder of the Speculative Fiction Academy, an English and creative writing professor, a horror scholar with a PhD in creative writing, and an MFA in speculative fiction, and a frequent contributor to the conversation around the evolution of genre fiction. Learn more about L. Marie Wood at L, as in the letter L, mariewood.com. Welcome, panelists. And I'm Adria Bailton. I'm your moderator on this panel. I also have written some short fiction and speculative fiction upcoming at Worlds of Possibilities and published previously in ZMB Presents, Constellation, and produced at Manawaker Flash Fiction Studios. So let us get started. So this panel is all about short stories. What are the benefits and challenges of writing a short story? Let's start there.
Well, To be honest, I love writing short stories, even though I'm predominantly a novelist. Short stories allow me to, it doesn't, sometimes ideas aren't going to be really, long. You can't always stretch them to 80,000 words or however many you're going for. So a short piece, and when I write short stories, I really like them short. I love flash fiction, like that's my thing. So sometimes the thing is just that short, but it's still a viable idea. So it really gives me a chance to explore different things, different places that I may not be able to extend, but I still want to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. All my published work is actually short fiction, with almost all of it being flash. So I joke that I'm either like a flash fiction person or a novel person, and there's like no in between. But one of my instructors at Juniper New Holland, she said something that really resonated with me. And she talked about how in writing spaces, a lot of the times writers conceive of incorrectly that, oh, short fiction's like these steps on the way to doing a novel, right? Their practice to doing a novel. But she's like, that's not true. They are their own craft, their own thing. They have their own rules. Things are successful in short fiction that are not in long form, and vice versa. And so I agree that I think some ideas just work so well in short fiction, that they're punchy and devastating and illuminating in a way that they would not be in long fiction. And so I think just the rules of short fiction are really fun for me, in the sense of like, I'm an SFF person. I love world building, but in a short piece, you don't have time for that. And sometimes I just want to talk about being in space without explaining why we're in space. And so that's for me the biggest strength and benefit of writing short fiction. It just, I don't know, I'm a little bit, I don't want to say more creative with short fiction, but I feel less inhibited by kind of having to explain everything.
One of my favorite things about doing short fiction is that, generally speaking, it's a lot quicker than writing longer stuff. And so it lets me spend a little bit of time on an idea and then move on to the next one, because my brain is so full of ideas that I will never, I don't think, have time to write them all. I like writing everything from 100-word drabbles all the way up to short stories. I'll go a little longer than that, but novels just really aren't my thing, despite having written some and published some. I'm drawn to the uh short fiction length because it lets me go through so much more territory without having to spend a huge amount of time on it.
So I agree with everyone so far. Hien, what she mentioned about the professor talking about short stories, that resonated with me because I kind of was from that mindset as well. I fell into short stories by accident. I was blocked on a novel, a manuscript that I had been working on for a while, and I didn't know where to go with it. I'd pitched it, I gotten requests, but it just wasn't taking. And I decided to write short just to like cleanse the palate, if you will. And I hadn't written short stories in years and years before that, not since college when I was getting my literature degree. Yeah, so I kind of fell in love with the format because, as Dawn mentioned, it let me experiment. I have sort of, if you can't tell, a butterfly brain. I like go from idea to idea to idea. Series, which seems so natural to people, is not natural to me, which is kind of a problem when you want to write in science fiction and fantasy, because the serial format is so popular. But after writing and publishing short stories in multiple lengths, anything from, I would say, about 3,000 to 8,000, 10,000 words, I'm getting back into the longer format. Like, I've written novellas, and I'm slowly making my way back to the novel world. And I don't think I would have had the confidence to do that if I hadn't taken this break to experiment in short stories. So to me, that's what the benefits have been.
Wonderful. So you all have talked about how it's just a different path than say novel. It's a different type of craft. So how important is word choice in short stories, and how do you strengthen that skill?
I will say for me, for short stories, because you have so few words to work with, right? Depending, Flash is under 1,000, Drabbles are 100, and short stories can range in length. And so the difficulty is making each word count, or each sentence not just do one job, right? And it can do one job, that's not a problem, but ideally they're advancing plot, character, they're saying something thematically, right? And I think for longer form fiction, because you have more space to work with, that pressure isn't quite there. And for me, that's what I have to be mindful with in short fiction. And again, for me, I think the writing process is kind of, I don't worry about it. I just need to write and get it out because that will be the story I want to tell. And then revision is where I go back and revisit words, right? And so writers joke all the time about using words that are unnecessary, or, there's a synonym that's more succinct. I find for short fiction, succinct isn't necessarily always better, because sometimes a word, you use it because it says something else that you need for your short story. So I would say, don't be afraid of the thesaurus. I have like Word Hippo up as I'm revising, experiment, even the wild ones. I'm like, this probably sounds wrong, but I'm just going to try it. So it's really doing that for me, right? Just practicing and then figuring out what matches with the voice of myself, as well as this short story I'm working on.
Definitely, I think that especially when you're looking at the very short forms, the word choice can be everything. And sometimes it's finding a word that can do double duty, that can both get your point across as well as sort of add another layer to it. That can be really satisfying to be able to do that. The other thing that I often mention when I'm talking about wording and short fiction is that there are ways to use shorthand, so to speak, in a short story. For example, if I say the words a high school gymnasium, everyone who has been in an American high school, or possibly even a worldwide high school, has an image in their head with just those words, high school gymnasium. And so I don't necessarily have to describe that it's got a basketball hoop at each end and there's bleachers and things like that, because everyone fills in those details automatically. And so using shorthand like that in short fiction is a way that you can use the limited words to really do some of the work, do some of the heavy lifting for you. And then the other thing that I wanted to say about language and short fiction is that just all the different lengths inform the other lengths. So when you get really good at being very concise for a drabble or very concise for flash fiction, it then helps when you're writing something a little bit longer that you already know how to make the most of your words. And I feel like poetry lends itself to that too, and vice versa, in that by practicing that poetic language, you're getting a lot of experience in what really works in both poetry and in prose.
I have to agree with both. Right? Just, you don't have a lot of real estate, so you have to make the most of what you have. And like you mentioned, Dawn mentioned, a double duty. The words have to be able to do more than one thing, but at the same time, you can't compromise your voice there. You can't compromise the, I write psychological horror, so it can do double duty, but it can't just lay everything flat out either. I need it to be a little more, so it's hard. And that's the beauty of short fiction, because it is difficult for someone who writes longer form. It can feel like impossible, because it's a whole different animal. But it requires you to train your hand. And it's just a wonderful opportunity for exercise. So yeah, I mean, I think also to find your own voice, because in that you have to struggle so closely to make sure that you're staying within whatever the word count might very well be. I've just started writing drabbles myself, and that is not easy at all. I mean, not at all. 100 words on the nose, that's hard. And but it helps you to find yourself and find your voice and find out how you can make a story work. And for me, that's the beauty of writing in a general sense, because so many different things will help you to learn. And, as Dawn mentioned again, it informs the next form. If you want to try another style, you already know how to be concise or with your own voice. You know how to, and if you're trying a novel and coming down, you already know what it's like when you have all the space in the world to write however much you want. Now you can trim it to make it fit.
So I think of word choice as something that can fall very easily within either your creative voice or your critical voice. And so what Hien and Dawn were talking about, for example, about picking the right words and stuff, that and drafting with those words, that to me speaks of creative voice. Sorry, that speaks to me of critical voice, because you're thinking about specificity. For example, like if you want to say dark blue, you can say that in one word by saying navy, you know, and that sort of thing. But that is very analytical. And that's something that comes after you've drafted your story, because to what Elle Marie was saying about don't lose your voice is where your creativity comes from. And if you're constantly adding into yourself as you write, then you're inserting this critical voice that is going to make you lose what makes you unique as an author. So I think it's very important to also separate, when are you thinking about your word choice? Is it when you're drafting? Is it a part of your natural creative process? Or is it afterward when you're editing and it's part of your analytical editing process?
That's really those are all really helpful tips in understanding how you strengthen your word choice skills. What other things do you need to be cautious of while writing short stories?
So I think there's a tendency, especially among novel writers who are trying to pull back and write short stories, to go big. You know, you're so used to thinking about the grand scheme of things, the big conflict, the final battle, you know, all these pieces to our hero's journey or storytelling structure that we're used to writing to. And when you're starting to think about short stories, you need to really dial that back down. You need to think about one main character, you know, and one main conflict. And even if you have all these side characters and stuff, they cannot go off on side quests, because that's how you blow it up into a novel. And so I think that's one of the big challenges, is just remembering to think a lot smaller, to drill down a lot deeper.
Yeah, I would agree with that a lot. I'm a slush reader for a sci-fi magazine, and that's something that comes out to me, right? Where a piece is pretty long, right? And it's a good piece, but in the back of my head, I'm like, why isn't this a novel? Because it's so lush and there's so much going on. And so I think thinking of scope is really important. Like, why this specific story? Why here? Why now? And that's something you do think about in novel form, but with short stories, it has to be so specific, right? There is a reason why we're looking at these characters at this point in time. And on that note, the other thing I think of about being cautious is we talk a lot about every word needing to matter and every sentence needing to matter, which I think is accurate, right? That's absolutely true. But I find I can kind of lead into the opposite. Well, I'm like, okay, if every word needs to matter, then I'm driven to make something maybe more action-packed, right? More plot-driven. But if the story I'm writing isn't necessarily a plot-driven story, right? If it's a quieter story, those can exist in short form, and that's perfectly okay. But I think making words matter and making words count should kind of make sense with the story you're writing, not necessarily be just about, you know, these high-octane stories. So that's something I definitely think I've had to be cautious about, and I notice when I'm reading as well.
For me, it's something goes back to something that Elle talked about initially, about knowing what size the story you're telling is. There are some stories that have that grand scope that fit as a novel. And then there's some stories that are much, much smaller. They're either one small action, or like Hien said, they're things that are very quiet or cozy. Cozy has been really popular lately, and they're very comforting to read. They're very comforting to write. And not every story has to be, you know, saving the world. And that smaller moments and not saving the world lends itself better to short fiction, I think. And so, you know, sometimes I'll come up with an idea and I'll be like, all right, I'm ready. I'm going to write this as a short story. And then suddenly it's, you know, 5,000 words already. And I'm like, oh, this isn't a short story anymore. And so just being aware of what size of idea fits is, I think, one of the key things that you have to look at when you're writing short.
I think that it's important to remember that you really do need a beginning, middle, and end. It is a story that stands alone. And often, people think short story, especially if they write long, they think short story can be a snippet of something else, could be, I've seen people doing like where they're writing short stories that relate to other worlds, but that doesn't mean that you don't do any world building within that story, because someone may only read that story and not that other world, be completely unfamiliar with that. So they don't know what you're talking about in some scenarios. So you have to make sure that they can stand alone. But that also does not mean that I think that a short story has to, have a whole lot of exposition and just, it doesn't have to be that, but it can have an open-ended ending, but it needs to be self-contained. So that's why when I mentioned earlier that I think that short story writing is difficult, I think novel writing is difficult. I think screenplay writing is difficult. I think writing poetry is difficult. I think all this stuff is hard, and that's that's why we practice. That's why it's called a craft. That's why we study. We work hard. We keep going and learning all the time. But it's unique animal, its own unique animal, and it absolutely requires a focus on some of those skill sets. And so just using a snippet of something or just kind of writing a blurb, that's not really a short story. You have to make sure that there's something that has a beginning, middle, and end.
In the process is, how do you decide whether an idea is a short story or novel or piece of flash or dravel? Or do you write to length? Do you go in with an idea of I'm writing this many words? So if you're all amenable to answering that, we can move forward, or we can skip it since it did just come to me during the discussion.
I love that. I love that you thought of something while we were talking. That's perfect. Now, to me, from my perspective, I never know when I sit down to write what it's going to be, because I'm a pantser. I am not an outliner. So I am literally saying, hey, I feel like writing today, and I do so. So whatever comes up, it can be whatever length comes up. So I'm writing, and you can kind of get a feeling of it. If I've gotten to the point, if you will, a little quickly, it's a short story. That's it. It's not there's nothing to expand on here. It might be a really neat idea, but it might not be something that can be long. And I just let that happen. Over the years, and I've been writing, I refuse to say the years now. I've heard myself say it too many times. I'm just not. So, but over time, let's put it that way, I have just learned to let my process be my process, and let what I'm doing be what I'm doing. You know what I mean? I think there's a tendency at certain stages of our career to try and, force certain things to happen. Or I want to have this novel done by X. I want to have, this many short stories done so I can make a collection and have it out by X, whatever that is. And I just I'm not doing that anymore, because I find that where I'm trying not to be pinned down by convention, if you will, and I'm a pantser. I don't plan anything, but I was still planning releases, if you will. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I stopped doing it and allowed myself to be. And in doing so, I just tried things. Like someone mentioned a dravel to me. I didn't even know what they meant by that word. And I looked it up. I'm like, I never heard that before. Let me try that. And now I'm like, I've written 10 of them, and they're so much fun. And it's a whole different way that I even think about writing. But I didn't, one of them was an idea that should have been longer. I said, okay, let me stop doing that. That's a longer piece. Let's try another one. And I did that. So you just sit down and write, I would say, from a pantser's perspective. So long story short, I really never know. That's funny. Long story short. Anyway, I never really know what my work is going to be. And I love the freedom that gives me is more important to me than anything else I've learned in this entire, however many long years career that I've had. I really appreciate that aspect of it.
Yeah, I'm both a pantser and a plotter, a planter, if you will. And I find that for the stories that I sit down and write and I kind of struggle with and I don't know where they're going, they end up being ones that, for me, typically work with long form, right? They're the ones I need to figure out what's happening when it's happening, right? But for the stories that come really easily, they tend to be the ones that are short form fiction. And usually for me, it's almost a difference between sometimes I have an idea and it says something thematically that I really want to get down. And those are my short pieces where I can kind of get it out and just go for it. And then if I have more of like a very plot driven idea, right? So I'm pointing the wrong direction. I don't know what direction it is, but my debut novel is about twin sisters who are separated. And that idea came to me and I was like, okay, this makes sense as a novel. I need to figure out why they're separated. I need to get them back together, right? So for me, it's almost like concept versus theme, and sometimes they switch. But again, I echo what Elmarie said, and trusting your process. So whatever it is, I think it will, the story that needs to be will come out from that.
And I have the third part of that triangle in being a plotter. And so I outline my short stories even. I don't outline flash or smaller than that because I don't usually have time, or not so much time, but I don't have the need for an outline for those. So if I sit down and I say, okay, I'm going to try to write this as a flash, and I start writing it and it starts creeping up in word count, then I say, okay, that's not a flash, put it aside. Now I'm going to do a flash. But I also am not going to say how long I've been doing this, like Elle, but long enough that a lot of the time when I have my idea based on how many characters I anticipate it having, and sort of like Hien said, with the theme and the ideas that I want to get out, I can sort of guesstimate a word count just based on my idea. And it's a skill that you kind of learn when you've done a number of short stories of varying lengths. My natural length for a short story tends to be 3,000 words, give or take. And that's just where I hit. Every once in a while I'll hit something longer and I'm like, oh, this surprised me. But yeah, I think I can just tell. And I will say that when I started doing fiction writing and when I started writing short stories, I had at least 2 that I can recall where people said, is this really the whole story? Is this it? And one of those turned into a trilogy and the other one turned into a novella. So nowadays I can usually tell, but when I first started, that was a skill that I still needed some honing of just figuring that out. But what I would say for people who are new to writing short fiction is that sometimes you can tell, and sometimes you have to play and experiment and just see what happens, see what comes out, and then figure out what it is in terms of definitions later.
I was about to say, I very rarely meet a plotter in the short story world. So thank you, Dawn, because that was enlightening. I am a discovery writer. I am Pantser, yes, discovery writer. And I had to learn it the hard way. And the hard way is just getting down and doing the dirty. I mean, just write and practice and just figuring out your process. And for me, that's what I do. I start with a concept. I start with a character. I start with a voice, whatever sparks that creative voice in me that says, okay, this is something I need to get down on paper. I just start writing and we see where it goes. Sometimes I will write to a prompt, and often that prompt comes with a word count limit. So I'll kind of have that in mind. And I've done this often enough where I feel like my comfortable length when it comes to short stories is between 6,000 and 8,000 words. If I hit 4,000 and I know there's like this much story to go, I'm like, yeah, that's not going to fit that prompt. And I'll either keep writing it, depending on how deep I'm into it, or if I really want to submit to that prompt, I'll set that aside and then write a different one. So yeah, I don't go into a writing session thinking, oh, this is definitely a novella, or I think might turn into a novel. I just sit down and write and see what happens.
Wonderful. I think that is, when I started writing, it's one of the hardest things I found was, how do I know if this idea is a flash or a novel or a short story or what length? So thank you for sharing on that topic on a sort of a short notice. So it is kind of related to the next question. And how does the writing process change, if at all, from a full-length novel, both in writing and in revision?
My answer is probably pretty quick on this. It does not change for me. Pantser does as Pantser does. I really don't, I'm not, I just don't, and I go with it and I like it because well, again, it helps me. It's what I've learned about myself, but I like to find out what's going on in the story at the same time as my characters do. It's really exciting for me, and it keeps the passion for the story going. If I've become bored, then there's a mistake somewhere in the work. And what I don't do is I don't self-edit in the middle of the writing. That's for I write the draft, then I go back and look for short stories and long. So unless I'm bored and I can't move forward, there's a problem and I have to fix the problem. That's not quite editing. I can't finish this, I don't know. So we should name that something else. But I definitely just don't change that process purely because it works for me. So I know that other people do change their process for long and short, but for me, I don't.
Yeah, I will say as someone who switches that for novel length form, I have to plot. And that's mostly almost a discipline thing where I'll get like overwhelmed with the diversity of choices I can make and just won't write. So I need the plot, but then for short, I can pants because I feel free to do whatever. I will speak to the revision part of it though. I feel like for short fiction, for revision, I end up being more brutal early on because as I'm reading, I'm like, I don't need that line. Like, but for a novel, for some reason, because it's so long, I just feel more precious. And like, I can change this later. But for me, short fiction is much easier to be like, no, like hack that out, change it, rewrite it, right? And maybe I need to adopt that for my novel form as well. But I find that to be the biggest difference between how I approach the different forms.
Literally, my only change is I write short stories in Word and I write novels in Scrivener. That's it. Other than that, I am a pantser and I just let the characters go.
For me, I feel like when I'm writing a longer length, revision takes a lot longer and takes a lot more passes. If I write a short story, I can finish the story, I let it sit for a little while, and then I come back to it and I'll do one sort of heavy revision where I make sure that, my plot is working and things like that. And then I might do one, maybe two lighter rounds of revision. But if I'm writing a novel or even a novella, I'm like, write it, revise it, revise it some more, revise it some more. I feel like there's so much more revision that happens. And I suspect it's because when I write longer form, I write messy. I write really, really messy. I just like dump onto the page. And I feel like with short fiction, there is a little bit of that analytical brain that you mentioned, C, about thinking about it as I'm writing. So I do kind of self-edit as I write. I think it's also worth noting that I am an editor first and came into fiction later. So part of my brain is always editing. I cannot help it. I'm reading people's novels and I'm like, oh, I would have done that differently. But so because of that, I think that my short story editing process is kind of more automatic, whereas my longer form editing process, revision process, just it takes me so much longer. And not just because it's more words, but because my brain is like, okay, this pass is going to be adding in the details that I left out. And this pass is going to be, why did I write that so wordy? And just, so yeah, it takes me a lot more effort to revise long form, and short form I find easier to revise. So, yeah.
Well, for the people who hate revising, maybe they need to all start going to short form based on responses here. All right, so then how do you balance exposition with action in a short story?
Okay. I might go on a little bit of a rant, so if you need to edit this later, please feel free. So I think this kind of speaks to something that Hien brought up earlier, and that's about stories not always needing to be plot driven. And I have a tough time with that because I am not a naturally plot driven type of writer. And I was just recently studying a different story structure where, like, every other page, I was like, holla frickin' Luya, this is exactly what I'm writing. And what it is, it's the heroine's journey. I don't know if you all have heard of it. Gail Carriger wrote a sort of modern applicable version of the heroine's journey. And it's about how a heroine, and it does not have to be gender, male, female, non-binary, whatever. It is just the archetype, the term that she's using for this archetype. Their journey is not necessarily about fighting a big bad at the end, mano a mano. It is finding community and finding a place in the world and finding like self-actualization. I was like, that is the majority of what I write. And these are the type of stories that get characterized as quiet. And so I find that in a short story, even the quiet stories, if you do tend to write quiet stories like I do require exposition and setting and grounding the reader, especially when you're writing science fiction and fantasy, because these are worlds that are outside of the known world that we're used to here in the contemporary Earth. And so the way I ground my readers is I make sure I am deep in my character's point of view and in their voice. And so as they're experiencing the world around them, so is the reader. So for example, if I am in a tiny spaceship capsule, and I'm an astronaut, right? Maybe I've trained thousands of hours to survive in a capsule and I'm fine, I'm comfortable. Just to me is a feeling of safety. But if I am me, C.H. Hung, stuck in a tiny castle, I am freaking the hell out. And so like seeing that same setting in two different viewpoints can tell you a lot about the world, as well as the situation your character is in and whether there's conflict immediately and what they need to do to get to resolve that conflict. So to me, for short stories, I tighten and focus really deeply into my characters. And that's how I get the exposition laid out for my readers.
I start right in the middle of the action, immediate res, immediately. I love it. For short fiction, it is like perfect for what I'm doing, because I just want to get to it. You know what I mean? I kind of wanted to move because I write flash. So I'm not going, I think I wrote something that was 2,800 words the other day. And I was like, really? I couldn't believe that it was that long. And I say long and people are like, that's not long at all. But for me, it is for short fiction. So we need to get going. I write horror. So I need to have you on edge right away. You know, I can build you up to the part that really should scare you, but I need to have you on edge in the first place to engage you in the story. So I write right in the middle. And that's it. Again, it's about when you sit down to write short fiction or anything at all, I don't think you need to sit and then first open up a textbook and study. But along the way, you've got to figure out some of these techniques, if you will, so that you don't feel out of sorts. Now, we're always going to find something new, like what you just found out, CH. I don't know that I'd heard that terminology before for that journey. And how refreshing is that, right? I mean, I think that we learn something new all the time, but there's some basics that I love that I keep coming in and out of the earth. Do you not see my shoulders are disappearing and I'm like suddenly part of the world? I don't know. Anyway, that's distracting me, but I'm also getting a story idea from it. So I don't know. If anyone sees me like looking at it and playing with it every now and then, I'm like watching it. Anyway, moving back, and you don't actually need to edit that out because that's hilarious. So either way, I think that, you know, we have to be open to different, I don't want to call it a tactic, but frankly, that's the only word I have for it. You know, different strategies. How about that one? Because the story that you want to tell may not fit into the bucket that you think it should. You know, character driven, plot driven. It might be both. It might be less. It might feel like you need to do all this exposition, but you don't have the space for it. That doesn't mean the story's not a short form story. It just means you've got to figure out a strategy to make it work. So there's just strategies you can try, you know, and that might require some study, or it might require you just writing it and then looking at it in your first draft review and saying, okay, did it work? Because there's nothing wrong with recreating the wheel. I mean, that's what fiction is. We are authors and we're here to make stuff up. So we need to try and learn new ways to make stuff up.
Yeah, I think in terms of the exposition and fitting it in, that like like CH and L said, you have to have it, you know. But I think that it's a matter of figuring out where you can put it into a story that makes it less obtrusive in a lot of cases. And so if you've got somebody, for example, in that space capsule and they're feeling comfortable, they're feeling like this is home to them, there can be just little details about, you know, them remembering, oh yeah, you know, the training that I spent 10,000 hours or however many in a similar situation, and this is comforting to me, as opposed to, oh my God, why am I in this tiny little closet of a space and how I can't even stretch my arms all the way out and things like that. And that exposition also contributes to the characterization, which is amazing because, you know, you're again covering two things at the same time. And when I write short as opposed to flash, I do sometimes run into a situation where I have to do what I like to call mental throat clearing, which is getting some of that exposition on paper. And I know I'm going to cut it, but I have to get it out there so that my mind can fix on what's there. And then later on, I can take those 3 or 4 paragraphs or whatever and seed them in during revisions to the appropriate places. But sometimes I just have to get them out there first, if not in the story, at least in another document, so that I've got those details nailed down for me. I'll do a lot of research but for a lot of my stuff. I also write historical. So when I'm writing historical, I absolutely have to do the research first, get the details, figure out what I'm going to do with them, and then go. But then figuring out how to seed those details in a way that doesn't feel info dumpy is always a challenge. And that's where you're sort of, okay, I can slide this in right here and it fits. But sometimes, yeah, that all ends up at the beginning, and then I'm like, all right, that gets cut, but cut it later.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. And for me, it's been important to think about exposition and action. And I'm going to use slow and fast, and it's going to seem counterintuitive, but what has helped me is thinking of exposition as faster, right? Because a lot of information is being told at a distance and you're learning a lot. And being in scene, being in action, even though action entails things that are fast paced, which isn't untrue, you're in the moment, you're experiencing things, you're seeing things are coming at you slower. And thinking about, for short fiction, when does one of those make sense, right? And to speak to something Ellen Marie brought up, I try not to be afraid of like wasting words, because sometimes I write something as like exposition or write something as action, and then I try writing it in the opposite, what makes sense. And sometimes I'm like, that didn't make sense, and you kind of figure out, I need to fix this part. So I know writers can be very precious about words. I definitely am, but sometimes I just need to experiment to figure out what makes sense and what doesn't. And I literally don't know until I just kind of get it out, as kind of Dawn pointed to, of being able to like, okay, now I know where to weave things in. Now I know what doesn't need to be there, etc.
All right then. So where are we at? So now that you've written your short story and revised your short story, what is your preferred way to share a short story? What are the pros and cons of each, such as anthologies, lit mags, blogs, podcasts, etc.? Anything else I've left off the list?
I have a fairly short answer for this one, and it is where will pay me for it. Sounds kind of mercenary, but honestly, if I can send a story to a market that's perfect for it, they buy it, I am happy. That's basically it.
Yeah, there's, if you've been, there are markets that are for the love, right? And that means no money. I just want to be clear. And when in it, like, all right, I have to date myself to some degree, but in the early 2000s, when we would write and we're coming out and we're doing these things, we want to just get the work out there, and you see these for the love markets and you think that means, exposure, and it doesn't necessarily, in most cases, it does not at all. And that's not something you'll ever know. And that, you know, you can look at readership numbers, you can do all that different stuff. Really, I would urge you to just go ahead and keep writing and move on. But the key here for your writing, and is any writing at all, is that you just don't give your work away. Okay, I believe money should flow to the author. So if you're going to write your work, doesn't mean if you think that you found a market that's paying, you know, 1 or 2 cents a word, but that's the market that looks like it should work for this piece and you're excited about it, then submit there. That's not what I'm saying. There are pro rates, there's semi-pro, there, you know, there's whatever is there's a gamut, the whole gamut of rates. It's about finding a prompt that you like and you want to submit, or a market rather that you like and wanting to submit to that place and you feel comfortable with it. But I don't think you should give your work away for free, as in zero money. Okay. So sure, sometimes we talked earlier about writing towards a specific prompt. Well, if you saw something, if you saw a call for submissions and you were clearly wanting to write for that market, but that doesn't mean there are not other markets that would like your work as well. On top, so in that regard, it doesn't matter to me if it's an anthology or if it's a magazine or if it's a whatever, that doesn't matter. It's about where you think the work fits and if someone's going to pay you for your work. You can also create a collection. If you've got a whole bunch of stories, you can assemble them into a collection and submit that around. And publishers are producing collections all the time. So that's another stream of income for yourself. You know, indeed, I would suggest sell your short story to some market and then put it in the collection, sell it again. You know what I mean? It's like you should be recycling these works because it's your time and effort. You put your effort into these words. This is your product and it's yours to sell. And when I say sell, it sounds like I'm just saying, you know, we're just selling our wares, because really the goal is to have your work read by the world, right? If you think about whatever your motivation is for writing in the first place, some people are motivated by money. I'm not saying not to be motivated by money. I'm saying just be sure you check that and be sure you understand what money you're dealing with. That's important. That's a separate conversation, but it's important to consider, because if you're only looking for money, then I don't know, being an author, that's a rude awakening for most, you know. You know, but if your goal is to have people read your work, if you want to impact people with your words, then you should be actively putting that stuff out there. So in the end, I think ultimately it doesn't matter to me where I put my work, as opposed, that's not to say it could just be any magazine. Everyone's going to have their own criteria, right? But I think you should be paid for the work that you're putting out there.
So I agree with what's been said, but I am also someone who has, at the early kind of stages of my career, submitted to free markets. And so I think what Elmarie said about criteria is really important. So figuring out whatever criteria makes sense for you. And so in early in my career, when I was even thinking about money yet, it was, okay, what publications resonate with the stories I want to tell? And that's still definitely true now, but as I've kind of evolved, I'm like, okay, now I only submit to paying markets. And so thinking about what criteria makes sense for you at your stage of the career you're in, and not feeling pressure, because I think with writing, you know, there's always a comparison and feeling like, well, I need to just submit to the most prestigious markets or the highest paying markets. And you know, if you want to, go ahead, do that. That's great. But don't feel pressure to. Like, if there's a publication you love and it's, you know, not the highest paying market or not the most prestigious, submit to it if that's what you want to do, right? So I would say don't self-reject and don't limit yourself by what you think you should be doing versus what you want to do. And I think that's so easy. And I will say, as someone who reads for a publication, and I say this not to be negative, but it's just there are so many wonderful stories, right? And there are so many good stories that maybe don't fit in this magazine right now, but fit somewhere else. So that's why it's important to not self-reject, right? Not to limit yourself, but also you should be submitting widely, just because, you know, there are so many stories, and even the quote unquote less prestigious magazines have to accept a certain amount out of so many submissions, right? So think of the criteria, think of what works for you. Don't self-reject. But if, you know, thinking about, I don't know, I just say that because I feel like I know people who think about prestige a lot and get obsessed with it, and it makes them really unhappy. And so your writing should not be making you unhappy.
100% seriously. So I wanted to go back and address some things that have come up as we've all been talking about this subject. Dawn mentioned mercenary, Elle mentioned money, Hien mentioned prestige. So there's like 3 hot button topics there for writers, right? As we're starting out, we think we're going to write the great American novel or story or whatever, make $1 million selling our rights to Netflix. Have it made. Well, that's not the way life works out for most of us. So, I have literally racked up hundreds of rejections. I have a spreadsheet with all my rejections. In fact, I had to move it to Airtable because there were so many rejections. And the reason why is because a lot of venues that you submit your stories to are going to say, don't resubmit a story that's already been rejected. Well, when you write and submit as much as I do, you're going to forget. And I had to, like, I remember sending a story in to an open call, and then I was like, oh crap, putting it into my Airtable and then realizing, oh crap, I already got rejected by this venue for that exact story, and I had to withdraw it right away. So there's a strategy to this, and I would say don't be afraid of wanting to make money on your writing. We talked earlier about creative voice and critical voice. Well, at the end of the day, you're also a business owner, right? And your writing is your product, and you're trying to sell your product. And so if you want to have a business being a writer, you have to learn the ins and outs of money. That's just the way it is. And so, and he was talking about self-rejecting. So the strategy that I have is submit to the most prestigious places first, the ones that pay the most money, have the most visibility, and will reject you the fastest. Because then when you get that rejection letter, you just send it on to the next place. Because a lot of these venues, as you do research, will not accept simultaneous submissions. They don't want you sending the same story to 5 different magazines at once. Because if they decide to accept your story and then you say, oh, sorry, already been accepted elsewhere, they're gonna be kind of ticked at you, honestly. It's just an etiquette thing that you learn, right? And so for me, that starts at the top. You go to Submission Grinder. If you Google Submission Grinder, it's a free database, crowdsourced of all these different science fiction, fantasy, mystery, horror places where you can submit stories. You can filter by length and whether they're open or not. And I start at the top, 10 cents a word. All right, you're getting my story first. And as that story gets rejected, I just go down the line. And if it gets to a point where I'm out of pro or semi-pro places to submit that story, I'll sit on it and I'll wait to see if there is a place, whether it's a charity or a royalties only or whatever place who's looking for a type of story that might accept that story, then I'll ship it over there. And you may wind up like I do with a trunk full of stories that have not found a home yet. Well, that's when you, as Marie is saying, put together a collection of your stories. And honestly, in this day and age, self-publishing is so powerful. I would self-publish. A lot of small presses won't accept a collection unless you're a known name with a platform. A lot of us don't, right? But self-publishing gives you a lot of control over your brand, your name, your cover, the way your stories are ordered. There's a lot of freedom in that. And then again, you're picking up skills to be a small business owner as a published writer, things that are going to help you in the long run. So that's my strategy when it comes to submitting stories.
I wanted to
Just
briefly
wanted to-
add.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
first.
I was just going to follow up and say, yeah, what CH said about submitting strategies is absolutely yes. I mean, I say whoever will pay me, but there is a system to that. And I also have racked up hundreds, if not thousands of rejections. And one thing I want to say about that, the short story market, and really any writing market, whether you're submitting novels to agents, whether you're submitting short fiction or poetry or whatever to markets, rejection is a reality of this business. And it is important to know that when a market rejects your story, they are rejecting your story, not you as a person. I could not tell you how many times I have gotten rejections from some of the major, most prestigious speculative fiction markets, but none of them have ever said, we don't like you, stop submitting. It's just a matter of keep trying, because because they get so many more submissions than they could ever dream of publishing. And so you're going to get rejections. If you don't get rejections, congratulations, that's amazing. But the likelihood is you're going to rack them up. And you just have to remember it's about your story. It's not about you. And it doesn't mean your story is bad. It's the reality of the market.
Yeah, I was gonna add, if you're watching this and you're freaking out like, oh my gosh, I submitted to like, or got pubbed in free or non-paying markets, or I posted things online, like that's fine, right? As Elmarie Ward was saying, submit. You can submit as reprints. One of my pieces I had posted on my blog. It's like, you know what? I'm just experimenting. Took it off, edited it, and then it got into All Worlds Wayfarer as a reprint. So your stories will always find a home. Don't stress out about it, but definitely, as CH said, value your work, value your words. All of you said really, but
I think all those are really great ideas. That whole sort of submission hierarchy is great, and getting paid for your work. And and some pieces just go where they need to go too, right? Like some pieces you just have to decide what you want to do. Is that something you do want to put on your blog just so you have something to post there, or do you want to, put it in your trunk? Yeah. So that brings me to my final question, and you did somewhat address this when you in this last question, but what expectations should a new to short story submissions writer have about the process?
There was something I did want to add to the last bit, so I'll add it here. I think it'll address this. You mentioned, Dawn, that if a story is rejected, it's just that story, not you as an author. It's also that it didn't match that prompt. That story could have been fantastic. That happened to me once. I thought I'd written to the prompt, but when I saw the actual publication come out, I was like, yeah, that wasn't really right. But they enjoyed the story. And it was, which was validating, because I kept thinking, I'm trying something new. I don't know if I'm touching on it. I did not hit the prompt, but they enjoyed the story. So the work was good. It just didn't match what they were looking for at the time. And I sold it elsewhere. You have to realize, and it's hard. It's easy for me to say that now for all of us, I think, because we're talking about all the rejections we've racked up. We've got thick skin now, so, and that's something you must have. You have to learn how to just deal with it and not internalize these rejections as critiques of yourself. They're learning opportunities, or it's just a matter of that publisher being busy. Full with what they need for that one thing. But you've got to keep it moving, if you will. You submit a work, it doesn't get picked up, submit it again. It's like when they say get back on the horse, legitimately get back on the horse, send it right back out. There's no reason to sit unless you get some, feedback, which is unusual these days. But if you get some feedback that's going to give you some detail on what's not working for this story, and then even then you should look at that, review the story, and decide what you think. Do you agree with that edit? If you don't, then you don't. Just because someone says something isn't right, if you think it is right, I'm not saying be obstinate. There's really no way to say this piece of it, without sounding like I'm saying just buck the system. But ultimately, if you disagree with an editor about something, that we're not talking about grammar rules, even then though, right, guys? Grammar rules too. It depends on what you're doing. You've got to apply your own lens to any feedback that you're getting. You cannot take it and say, oh, they said these things are all wrong. This must be a terrible story. That's not the way this works. Not the way this works at all. So yes, when we talked earlier about study, you've got to, I hate to sit and harp on that, but you do have to learn the craft so that you can break certain rules and be confident in breaking those rules. So that answer kind of goes around a lot of ways, but I think it was important to say. So in essence, coming back to your question about, what should you expect? You should expect a lot of rejections is what you should expect. You're going to get them. Doesn't matter how good the story is. You're gonna mistake the market one day and send it to the wrong place. That's just gonna happen. So just deal with the fact that you're going to get the rejections, and they're not going to be personalized, and you're going to wonder why, and you cannot find out. Okay, because replying to the rejection and asking why is a mistake. So you've got to deal with the fact that the rejections will come, and you just got to grin and bear it and keep going.
And I would add on to that, once you write that story and you get it submitted, keep writing, write more and more and more, because the more pieces you have, the higher your odds become, because you can have them out, you know, send this piece over here, sends this piece over here, send this piece over here. And that increases your odds that one of those pieces might get picked up. So my suggestion is submit widely, submit frequently, you know, within the rules. Please follow the rules of markets. Don't become the person that is a cautionary tale. I have so many from when I used to edit a magazine. But yeah, just keep writing, keep creating, keep upping your craft level, and keep submitting them, and you'll find your place one way or another.
I wanted to circle back with something that Hien had said earlier about self-rejection. I think that's the biggest thing new writers can do, is not self-reject, because I know we all suck at judging our own writing. Yeah. And I know I would not have published in some of the venues I've been published in if I had continued in my pattern of self-rejecting. And it took a couple of people who I love and trust who told me, stop it, just send it in. And it proved itself over and over again that I was horrible at judging where my writing was going to land. That finally I'm like, all right, you know what? Everyone's right. F it. It is going in. You know, analog, why not? Asimov, why not? I still haven't gotten into Asimov, so that's okay. One day, right? And even with like something as inane as a silly award, and I'm not saying awards are okay, for me, I think they're kind of silly, so that's just my opinion. But like, you know, the Baen Fantasy Adventure Award, I do not write in the style that Baen prefers from their authors, but I had this story, and it was one that sat in my trunk and gotten multiple rejections, and I was like, you know, why not? One year I was like, why not? I'm just gonna send it in. It fits the criteria, like in terms of word count, and it's a fantasy. There's barely any adventure in it. Again, it's a quiet story. But whatever, sent it in. It tied for third. Okay, I was flabbergasted. I was like, are you freaking kidding me? I never thought I would write a story that suited Baen's taste. And so, yeah, to me, like the biggest lesson that newbie writers can learn is what Hien said earlier. Don't self-reject, just send it in.
Yeah, I was going to add that I think a lot of us and a lot of the viewers probably write in the SFF space. But and I assume this is true of a lot of us too, that we're also genre blend writers. And if you're in that camp, publications you think are quote unquote very literary and realist, like they look at those stories. So again, don't self-reject, submit widely. And I've had some stories that got rejections, but had some feedback. So presumably it got kind of close from the exact same story from a very literary publication and a very SFF publication, right? So don't feel bound by genre, definitely follow the rules. But again, don't just say, oh, my story must not fit, so I'm not going to submit. Like, you won't know unless you do. And, you know, to echo the rejection thing and being a reader, that sometimes it's really not about, it's like your story in the context of that issue, right? And so if I'm making this up, but if you wrote a story about intergalactic penguins and someone else wrote something very similar, and they're both wonderful stories, they're probably not going to be accepted in the same issue, and you would have no idea. So again, you know, build up that skin with rejection. Be sad if you need to, right? Go get a cup of coffee, get all cozied up, feel sad. That's completely fine. But I do think building up that endurance and just keeping writing is super important. In terms of just like logistical things, submissions grinder was mentioned. So that's one of the ways to track publications and track your own submissions. The other one is Duotrope. I will say in my experience, submissions grinder is free. It has a better SFF repository. Duotrope has a better literary repository, but again, it is paid, so it costs money. But if you are making some money from your writing, even a very small amount, you can, you know, write that off on your taxes. So do what makes sense for you. Yeah.
You all have said amazing things and wonderful tips and going forward, so that we have people trying out maybe short story writing if they've been writing novels, having some good plans and expectations going into submissions. Oh, my one thought was, now I remember, everyone here, I think, mentioned something about either being a slush reader or an editor at a magazine. And I think one of the things that can be helpful, you know, when you're a new short story writer is if you can read slush at maybe some short story length or for some market that you enjoy. But everyone had such great tips, and was, I think, a really great panel on short stories. If you want more content similar to this topic, you can check out publishing short stories from the 2023 WriteHive conference and writing short stories from the 2021 WriteHive conference. And I just wanted to ask all my panelists here, do you have any last thoughts, and also something where people can find your work, a new short story coming out, anything at all?
Well, I'll say that I think that you should make sure you're having fun at all times. I mean, that doesn't mean it's not difficult, the writing of it, you know, the sorting it out. But you're doing this because you want to do this. You should be enjoying yourself. So please do not stress yourself to the point where you can't produce your work. Give yourself a break, take a walk outside, get a, you know, get coffee, get soda, whatever it is, water. Just give yourself a minute and come back to it when you're ready. Do not, you know, take the joy of writing from yourself. So I have just actually, interestingly enough, my first, well, how do I phrase this? My, a collection of my first 3 collections has been combined and just recently released. It's called the Unholy Trilogy, or rather, I'm sorry, the Unholy Trinity. And I lost that argument of trilogy, trinity, whatever. So the Unholy the Unholy Trinity, and it has 99 short stories in it. I'm so excited. So it just came out last week. Gosh, it was Friday, from Mocha Memoirs Press, and it's available anywhere books are sold. So if you're interested in checking that out, that is there. It's perfect timing for this panel, huh? Thank you.
So my latest publication, as of the time of this recording, is Brother's Keeper, which is a novelette superhero. It wanted to be a short story, but turned into a novelette. Those things happen. But I will also have a collection out in May, on May 15th, called A Tarot of Sorcery and Sages, that is short stories and poetry themed around the major arcana of the tarot. So you can find all of my books, from novels all the way down to a children's book, and many, many, many collections of self-published stories and poetry at historythatneverwas.com. And I also blog there, so you can hear what I'm up to.
Congratulations, Elmarie and Dawn, on your recent publications. That's exciting, especially Elmarie. I mean, 99 short stories in one collection. That's amazing.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to seeing that. Yeah, so you can see what I'm up to at www.chhang.com. I am not great about keeping my website up to date on the blog part, just because I'm very, very private and quiet as a person. That's probably why my stories tend to be quiet. I'm trying to be better about it, you know, speaking about being better business owners and that sort of thing. But my last short story to be published was in Ellery Queen in the January-February issue earlier this year. It is one of the rare ones where it went long. It's close to 10,000 words, and I actually have a series in mind for it. So you just never know. So keep writing, even if you write short stories. I think the major thing that we're coming out of this panel with is don't sell yourself short, like value your work and keep writing.
I had one tiny thing I wanted to add, which was there are predatory contracts. So if you get accepted and you're not sure, read that contract, reach out, Reddit, Authors Beware, Writers Beware, Authors Guild. There are resources. So definitely do your due diligence with those. As for me, you can find my work at www.authorhien.com. I've had 2 recent short stories published. One is in Famidon Journal, about follows a girl to womanhood and a monster that haunts her. And then the other was on Speculative City, about a sentient landmass who is contemplating their own mortality. And in terms of don't know what side it's on. My debut young adult horror novel comes out fall 2025. You can add it on Goodreads now. And that's about all you can do with it, but it's about separated Vietnamese twins who reunite to investigate their mother's murder in a Midwestern town plagued by drowned ghosts.
Well, all those stories and novels sound absolutely amazing, and now I have to run right off and go find all of them and read them. And I hope everyone who's here to view this panel will do that too, and also will be going out and writing their great short stories. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you for viewing.